Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our series of podcasts called Menninger Mindscape. I'm Dr. John Oldham, Chief of Staff at the Menninger Clinic, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of an overview about a very interesting research project that we're carrying out here at Menninger. And then we have a couple of additional podcasts of some of our researchers where you can learn about this research in more detail. We call the research, it's kind of a funny acronym, we call it MindMB. And that actually stands for the McNair Initiative for Neuroscience Discovery at Menninger and Baylor. And it's supported with generous support from the Robert and Janice McNair Foundation. In addition to the foundation support, we have support from the Baylor College of Medicine, Menninger Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and from the Menninger Clinic itself. For those of you who are not that familiar with Menninger, Menninger is a 120-bed voluntary teaching hospital where patients come who often have been unable to respond well to earlier efforts to get better and to earlier treatments. We sometimes call ourselves kind of the court of last resort, and we're somewhat unusual because we have an average length of stay of about 45 days. I say that up front because that's an important feature that has enabled us to do this research that's hard to do when you're just working with patients in the hospital for less than a week. Our overall principal investigator of this study is Dr. Chris Free, and he's one of the researchers I'm interviewing separately. There are three main components to this research. One is what we call our outcomes data component. A second is neuroimaging, and a third is genetics. So I'll just tell you the bare bones of those three components. For our outcomes data, this is kind of a template of standardized data that we've been gathering here for quite some time, and this is very helpful in our clinical work to help our patients. So we do standardized, semi-structured interviews that are used throughout the country to get our diagnostic data. Then we do other specialized interviews that give us important standardized data about specific symptoms. An example of that would be the Beck Depression Inventory or an inventory called the PHQ. We study with standardized instruments personality functioning, emotion regulation, interpersonal functioning, and then the treatment process as we go forward. We do this every 2 weeks while the patients are here, also at discharge. And we're in the middle of a phase 2 of our outcome study, which is to follow our patients after they leave. And we're hoping to be able to keep in touch with them in a systematic way, evaluating them with these same instruments up to a year after they leave, because we want to see if the improvement that we do see in our patients, which is substantial, is maintained after they go back home. So that's sort of a very rich database that we have available. In addition, we're doing the second and third components of the study, which enable us then to marry or correlate the technology-driven new data with the standardized clinical data. The second part of the study that I mentioned is neuroimaging, and our basic scientist in our department is Dr. Ramiro Salas. He's one of the other researchers that I've interviewed on a separate podcast. And he works at the Center for Advanced MRI at Baylor. It's our Advanced Neuroimaging Center. And he's actually carrying out our brain imaging protocol. That's a protocol that has several components, and he'll tell you more about that. But one is structural MRI. A second is what's called DTI, which stands for diffusion tensor imaging. And that really shows, in addition to the structure that MRI gives us of the brain, this shows connectivity of the brain, how the parts connect to each other with nerve tracts and where they go. And then the third part is what we call functional MRI, where we're really able to look at how the brain works. And we do that looking at, first of all, what's called a resting state network. And then we're looking at two different aspects of brain functioning. One we call reward circuitry, and the other is on interpersonal connectivity and behavior and cooperation. And those are very interesting protocols, And you'll learn more about those when you look at Dr. Salas's interview. He tells us about that in more detail. The third component is our genetics component, and we haven't started that yet. Dr. David Nielsen is going to be our lead on that part of the study. We have collected all of the samples so that we have those stored, and once we embark upon that project, which we're going to do this year, we'll then start to get genetic data. We can then, in the end, compare our genetic data with the brain imaging data, with the clinical data. And I hope that will lead to some really wonderful advances that help us identify which patients respond to which type of treatment. This is treatment that's embedded in our regular clinical work. The outcomes data help us with our direct clinical care of our patients. These additional data, we hope, will generate findings that will help many patients in various types of conditions who are suffering. We hope that, in fact, one of the things that might come out of this is what's called the ability to identify biomarkers. And that means a lot of things, but in essence, it can be a technical finding, such as a genetic pattern or a specific brain imaging pattern that you can identify early. This is really in the spirit of what's called personalized medicine today, where you can take an individual patient and say, okay, this is a patient with depression. Here are the treatments that generally work. But the patient with this depression, this particular patient, has, let's say, a brain imaging pattern that signals that this patient may not respond to those traditional, usual treatments. So we want to then find out, is there a new treatment or a special combination of treatments which can reach that patient? And if we can know that at the front door, then we have a really good chance to help that patient in a way that might not otherwise be possible. That's a hope. We're not there yet, but that's the kind of work that's going on in many parts of the country. We're also able to do this because of our numbers. We have really large numbers of patients that will keep growing over time as we move forward. So that's an overall view of the project. I won't go into more detail at this point. I just wanted to introduce it. I do encourage you, if you're interested, to follow up and look at the other interviews with Dr. Free or Dr. Fowler or Dr. Salas. So tune in for more detail, and thank you again for joining us today.